Wonderful to be here. We have an important set of topics. To frame our discussion about long-term fiscal policy, demographics, entitlements, we're going to throw out a couple of data points. The U.S. fiscal deficit's been running about 6 to 7% of GDP in recent years, on track to keep doing so in the years ahead. If you know the kind of growth rate we've had, that necessarily means a rising debt-to-GDP ratio over time. Already, global bond investors are starting to question whether they really want to keep funding that borrowing at the kinds of favorable low interest rates we've gotten used to over the last few decades. And the demographic crunch from the retirement of the baby boom generation is no longer on some long-term horizon. It's in the here and now. It's happening around us. 20 years ago, there were about 5 working-age adults for every retirement-age adult. Now that's down to 3. That's on track to be at 2 in a couple of decades. The Social Security Trust Fund is set to run out of money in 2033, meaning the future of the program could be on the table in the next presidential election. Again, not a long-term problem, a medium-term problem. We don't know what the political environment will look like in the early 2030s, but color me skeptical that it will be one that allows the kinds of decision-making and deal-making that Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, Alan Greenspan engineered in the 1983 reforms that prolonged the finances of Social Security to this point. That's a lot to take on. Fortunately, we have 3 fantastic guests to do it. This panel is focused on long-term fiscal issues, but you can't talk about the long term without talking about the near term. So I want to start with just a few questions for Chairman Smith about the one big beautiful bill that passed the House last week that you played a crucial role engineering. We have 65 minutes, or we have an hour to work through all this, but let's start with the big beautiful bill before we go long term. Look, the CBO, other kind of independent modelers, all believe it will increase fiscal deficits. Elon Musk says he's disappointed it will make deficits bigger. What do you think they're missing about this bill?
So I disagree with my friend Elon Musk and others when they're talking about what this is going to do to debt and deficits. For one, this bill that we passed cuts $1.6 trillion of mandatory spending, which is the most ever, by 300% of mandatory spending that has ever been cut in the history of America. And when you look at the assumptions that the Congressional Budget Office shows is that it would provide $4 trillion added to the debt and deficits. That's also the same amount of just extending current tax laws is right at $4 trillion. So I don't buy into the fact under current existing tax policy that you're looking at $4 trillion. And I'll point out, this one bill, this one big beautiful bill cuts $1.6 trillion. DOGE, in 4 months, has cut $175 billion. So this is definitely right along and aligned and one of the biggest net impacts. And you were talking about revenue to GDP, spending to GDP. If you look at the history over the last 50 years, revenue to GDP has averaged 17%. We're currently at 17.2% of revenue to GDP. Spending towards GDP has averaged right about 20% for the last 45 years prior to the last 5. The last 5, it has averaged 26% of GDP. We have a spending problem in this country, not a revenue problem.
So I'm guessing a lot of people in this room are happy with what's on the corporate side of this legislation, bonus depreciation, R&D deductibility. Let's talk about the individual side. Things like no taxing on taxation of tips, taxes on overtime, auto interest loan deductibility, SALT cap raising. Is there a supply side case for those, or are those things that are not really going to help the kind of capital stock supply potential of the economy?
So this tax bill, this one big beautiful bill, was created by going outside of Washington, D.C. We went to more than 30 different states over the last 2 years, meeting with real small business owners, real working moms, real farmers, and to find the issues that they were facing in today's economy. My very first field hearing, my very first committee hearing as Ways and Means Chairman, was in a lumber yard in Appalachia, in Petersburg, West Virginia. That lumber yard closed 9 months ago. Over 500 people lost their jobs. These are real Americans that are facing real problems. And so the tax bill that we created all came from the feedback that we heard from those people traveling throughout the country, whether it was a farm in Yukon, Oklahoma, or a factory in Peachtree City, Georgia, or a homeless shelter in Chicago. These were all places that we went and we heard from people to write it. Of course, the main aspects of the bill, it creates permanency of the expiring provisions of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. It also adds the no tax on tips, the no tax on overtime. You look at the no tax on overtime, this incentivizes people to be more productive at work when we already have a shortage in labor. This is very proactive. And when you look at tax relief for seniors, we also juice some different items to help incentivize manufacturing in the United States by 100% expensing of factories, by 100% expensing through equipment, research and development, and also the interest deductibility favorable calculation. These are all things that, if you combine them, the effective tax rate for manufacturing in the United States would be right at 15%.
So I promise we're not going to go line by line through this very complex bill, but there's one thing that's kind of gotten a lot of attention in the last day that I want to raise. Section 899 of the legislation, which is makes foreign holdings of U.S. assets subject to an escalating tax, sovereign wealth funds, things like that. Can you comment on why this provision is in the bill, why you view this as a good idea?
So a big concern is that foreign governments, based on agreements entered by the Biden administration, is trying to suck away billions of dollars from U.S. companies. In fact, $120 billion from U.S. companies. And this is a way to help put them in check so that they understand that if they do that to U.S. businesses, there will be consequences for their actions. Hopefully, it'll never take an effect.
And the worry is that this will dissuade, this will disincentivize foreign companies, entities from investing in the U.S., possibly even treasury bonds. Is that a valid fear? Is that something we should be worried about?
I think you have to look at everything, but it's a valid fear of $120 billion of U.S. profits from U.S. companies being illegally taken. For example, when you look at Pillar 2 with OECD, they don't even recognize R&D expensing in our tax code. We're the first country in 2017 that created a global minimum tax. They don't even accept our global minimum tax. That's completely unfair. So we're being punished for actually following what they're trying to do. The fact that the Biden administration agreed to this is beyond me.
One last question for Chairman Smith, and we'll broaden the conversation. The legislation is moving to the Senate. What do you see as the path forward from here for actual passage? Are there any bright lines from the House that you would tell your Senate colleagues to not mess around with?
So we've been working hand in glove with Chairman Crapo, Leader Thune, throughout this entire process. I think when you look from the tax perspective, 90 to 95% will stay about the same, and you'll see some minor changes over there. We have a delicate balance. We could only lose 3 seats in the House of Representatives to pass this bill. We passed it 215 to 214 and 1 present. That's as close as you possibly can get. The Senate can only lose 3 votes. They have a 53 majority, and so when I started in the House, I figured that we were losing 2 before we started. There was 2 people that you just couldn't get there. We lost those 2 people. The Senate, I think, is the same way. There's 2 senators that regardless of what you do, they will always vote no. And so you can only lose 1 in both chamber in order to pass it. So you have to thread a very delicate needle, and you got to use balance. Some of the sticking points within balance is the state and local tax deduction. We had to use balance there because we had to make sure that it was a good common ground with our friends in New York, New Jersey, and California. We have members in our conference that was pushing me to eliminate any deduction, not even $1 for state and local tax. And then you have others that was asking for unlimited. And so just creating that center ground, I would encourage my counterparts, don't be too drastic. Be very balanced, and I think they have to be balanced with the makeup of the Senate.
So Gary Cohn, you were in the White House. You played a big role shaping the original TCJA that this extends. What do you like? What are you less enthusiastic about in the big, beautiful bill?
So, look, what I like the most is we are extending the current tax law. I think the horrible outcome would be to have gone through this 8-year period where we simplified the tax code, we made ourselves much more competitive in the world, we lowered rates, we reached all the objectives that we set out to in 2017, and then have them all expire 8 years later. the volatility of that would just be unsubstantiated and would not make any sense on the personal side or on the corporate side. Although the corporate wouldn't change, there would be the trickle-down effect. So the fact that Chairman Smith and his committee understand the importance of predictability and continuity of what we put in 8 years ago, I think is very, very important. So overall, you like what's going on. I think the chairman also brought up a really, really important topic, and if you take nothing else away from here, I think this is the important takeaway. You know, there was a lot of discussion in 2017 when we wrote the legislation, you know, people talking about it being a giveaway to the rich. This is a tax break for the rich. And the chairman gave you the numbers. Our tax collections as a percentage of GDP actually went up with the new legislation. And that is the important piece. What's happened on the deficit side is our spending. And this really, you know, you could talk about COVID, and you could talk about the need for the federal government to get involved in COVID. And I think many of us in this room would say this is exactly when the federal government should get involved and should spend money, as when we're going through a pandemic or a national crisis. But once the crisis is over, the government has to remember what steady state run rate looked like prior to the crisis or prior to the pandemic. So the tax revenue side of what we did in 2017, and what Jason and the committee is doing, continues to make enormous amount of sense. The real issue is on the spending side, and I think that's where people have to understand what steady state run rate looks like going back to let's go to 2019.
So is seeing this legislative process making you nostalgic for 2017, or are you glad that you're a long way from the West Wing right now?
Both. I mean, both. What we did in 2017 was almost nothing short of extraordinary. We were told we couldn't get it done. We were told it was 32 years since, and we're sitting here at the Reagan Library, so we were told it's 32 years since tax reform had been done. It's impossible to get done. You know, it's very difficult to lower rates. It's very difficult to move the corporate taxes. It's very difficult to touch many of the, you know, embedded deductions. You know, state and local tax was one of the embedded deductions we couldn't touch. We managed to get those things through, and then there's always massive gyrations inside, and Jason and I were talking about this before we came on, the subtlety behind the tax code and how difficult it is, and how many moving parts there are is really extraordinary. I said to Jason, when I did this in 2017, we had about $1.7 trillion of negative revenue deficit to work with in our period over the 10-year window. But to get to that $1.7 trillion of negative revenue, we basically spent about $6.7 trillion and brought in about $5 trillion, so it netted to $1.7 trillion. So literally when you're writing tax code, you're touching every part of the code, and it's very complex. And I know the chairman went through that this time. He was telling me how big the numbers were this time. So it is very complex when you touch all these things, and every time you touch a line of the tax code, there is an interest group somewhere that has an equal, I would say more than an equal and opposite reaction to what you're doing. So it doesn't matter how few dollars it is or how many dollars it is, there's someone that wants that originally left in the tax code the way they left it in. I'll just throw one out. In my day, you know, I was the villain that tried to take carried interest out of the tax code. Jamie's laughing. I was vilified by half the leadership in the House and the Senate.
Maybe some people in this room too.
Yeah, no, I know. It's me. It was me. You know, the good news is I think McConnell, Hatch, Ryan, and Brady, you know, the four of us who were sitting there writing tax code, they looked at me and said, Gary, we're going to do a lot of things here. We're not going to touch carried interest. I said, okay, I got it. So there's things like that you just have to deal with.
So as we go to Jerry Parsky, if you'd like to have a question, go into the app and click on this panel, and you can put in a question. I'll have it on the pad, and we'll layer those in as we proceed. Jerry Parsky, you buy and own and run businesses. What do you think this tax legislation means for the kind of growth outlook, capital spending, capital stock? As you look at it as a business person, investor, what's the upside here?
Well, I start with the proposition, having been in the government and now, as you say, look at from the corporate standpoint, and I look at President Reagan's directive. Bipartisanship is something that's critically important. Winning tax bills by one margin is not bipartisanship. We need that. And I think we need a tax code that is simpler and that is more pro-growth oriented. Growth can address many of the issues. We can talk a little bit about what we've seen in California. California is a big part of the economy today and going forward. And we set up a commission to deal with tax reform as well as public pension reform. We can talk a little bit about that. But from my standpoint, observing, I think this is a time we're edging toward crisis, and we got to be careful in that context on the economic side. Markets are very volatile. When you're overly dependent on the personal income tax, it's the most volatile form of tax. And businesses can't plan. Investors can't hesitate on whether they should buy or sell companies. So we have to step back. I'm not sure a big, beautiful bill that guarantees somebody will object to this or somebody will object to that will get us there, but it's better than doing nothing, as long as it's oriented around minimizing the reliance on the personal income tax. You need to broaden the base and be able to predict so you can budget carefully.
I mentioned earlier that there are some signs that global investors, bond markets are a little jittery about U.S. assets. We've seen this pattern where in turbulent moments, the dollar falls, yields rise. How worried are you about the bond market and the ability to keep sustaining these deficits going forward, Jerry?
Well, I for one, and I'd be interested in Gary's point of view too, I'm not as concerned about the bond market. In one sense, increased borrowing delivers interest payments to those that own the debt. And the people that own the debt are about 2/3 here, based here, 1/3 abroad. And so I'm less concerned about that than I am about this wide swings in volatility, which I think can cause real economic problems soon.
Gary, is something changing in the capital markets we should be nervous about?
Well, if you want an unpredictably wide swing in volatility, have a failed debt auction in the United States. So I think they're highly correlated to each other. You know, the interest rates market, or the risk-free interest rate market, as we like to believe it, U.S. Treasury market, drives a lot of underlying investment in the world, not just in the United States. And you know, the reality of it is we have the most robust debt market in the world until we don't. And the way the system's set up, it's set up with, I'm not going to go into the primary dealer system, the auction system. There's a lot of checks and balances in the way that we sell debt in the United States, but it's not a foolproof mechanism. You know, if there lacks interest from foreign investors and there lacks interest from US investors, and people don't think it's an adequate risk-adjusted rate of return, rates will move out dramatically and dramatically quickly. And one or two auctions later, you can be in a completely different system. And then when the government gets to a point where it can't efficiently finance itself, we have a completely different position. And when we're there, it's almost too late to deal with it.
Chairman Smith, how much does that set of worries kind of hang over you and your colleagues as you're writing these bills?
It's one of the biggest conversations, especially with our debt and deficit hawks. When you look at the fiscal health of the nation, that's your number one criteria. Unfortunately, we've been at a deficit spend the majority of the last 70 years. I think 4 years, we weren't at a deficit spend, but other than that, every year has been a deficit spend. And so looking at the revenues coming in versus the expenditures, it's very crucial on the economic outlook of the viability of our nation.
So there's this old Herbert Stein line that if something can't go on forever, it won't. The question is, this deficit trajectory the U.S. is on, what is the forcing event that makes it mean it won't go on forever? Does this come to a head, and can it be done without a crisis, Gary?
So look, I agree. I don't think this goes on forever. And again, the chairman mentioned this in his opening line. We've got another major event coming up in, let's call it 2033. We're looking at the report on Social Security Trust Fund. Right. Social Security publishes numbers every year to how the fund's going to work and when they're going to run out of money. The one thing we know is they will run out of money. What does that mean? That means by law that they curtail, they drop payments back down to a level where they can make sustainable payments based on the money that's in the fund.
It means automatic cuts to
automatic
Social Security recipients.
Yeah, and right now they're about, call them 20+% cuts. If you model it out, you see 20% cuts in Social Security coming 2032, 33, 34. It moves around. It moves around by lots of actuarial data. My strong view is, and I'm sure I'm probably right on this one, I don't think there's an elected official in the United States that's going to allow anyone's Social Security check to be cut. So I assume we will find a way to try and deficit finance our way out of Social Security. And we're not talking about something that's that far away. So you take the normal operating deficit that we have today, the amount that we're funding, the interest on that, now start adding on top of that the whole Social Security Trust Fund issue. And that's when I think you run into a potential real problem. It's almost unsustainable. Now, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but the Social Security Trust Fund thing could be solved. It's a really interesting 80-year actuarial algebraic equation. When you have 80 years of present value to work with, it's not that hard to solve. Unfortunately, we need to solve it today and avoid getting to that date.
I think it points out that there have been commissions established.
More than a few.
I hesitated repeating all the commissions, either for the president or for the governor of California, that I've been involved in, none of which have been listened to by the legislature. And there was a Social Security Commission that President George W. Bush established. Relatively straightforward recommendations relating to the retirement age, how you deal with the retirement age, how you accumulate the obligations that exist there in terms of cost of living adjustments. No one would listen. Same thing happened. In addition to Social Security, California is going to bring to Washington, at least that's the prediction of some of us, the unfunded liabilities for public employees in California. The idea of unfunded liability, I'd never heard of such a thing until I got involved with the government. Unfunded liabilities. It's not in the budget. It's not brought forward. It's just a liability that's going to come due. And for public employees' benefits, we did an analysis, another commission, not listened to, but we did an analysis of the unfunded liability just for California. It was $118 billion in 2008. Now it's $290 billion. This means this is an obligation that will come due. What will happen? California is going to go to Washington and say, bail us out. A number of you in the audience probably remember, it ages me, but that's perfectly okay. New York City had a problem, 1975. Came down to Washington. I was in the Treasury Department and said, we have a problem. You have to give us a guarantee or help us. George Schultz, who was a trustee here and a great friend of mine, said to President Ford, we shouldn't be doing this unless they get their house in order. Headline in the Daily News, President Ford to New York City, drop dead. That was the response we got. The same issue on public pension liability. It's going to be enormous. It and Social Security, the crisis will be coming.
So Chairman Smith, how much awareness is there of this looming set of issues in Congress? Is there any appetite to start working, maybe not in a very public-facing way, but behind the scenes to work through possible solutions now?
First off, it's extremely frustrating when within Congress is that Congress tends to always kick the can down the road with all the issues. I just look back at this one big beautiful bill, for example. Since November, I have been pushing every moment that I breathe that we have to pass the permanency of the expiring provisions of the 2017 tax cuts, and we need to do it as soon. It took us to Memorial Day. And I had numerous colleagues that's like, oh, you can do it at the end of the year. The 27 million small businesses that don't know if their tax rate's going to be 43.4% or 25 to 28%, they're investing, they're deciding, they're making decisions now. And so why would you wait? It's the same way with the Social Security Trust Fund and Medicare. Why do you wait to the last moment? Unfortunately, that's how Congress operates, and that's what they'll probably do. Mm-hmm. There are reasonable reforms, but it has to be bipartisan. Medicare and Social Security are two such important programs for all Americans, and this is not something one party can do. And so we've done over 20 different roundtables just in my first 2 years as chairman with House Democrats and House Republicans to try to figure out where can we find that common ground. And I'll tell you, passing bipartisan legislation is not easy. I passed a bipartisan tax bill that I negotiated with Senator Wyden, my counterpart at that time, and we got 84% of the vote in the House of Representatives, but then the Senate killed it for political reasons. If the Senate would have passed it, it would have saved our country $450 billion with a B dollars. And R&D, bonus, and interest could be made permanent very easy in this tax code. But unfortunately, bipartisanship is not always there. But I'm willing to do anything as long as it's delivering for the American people.
So let's talk about some of the kind of demographic long-term things that might change that trajectory. Meanwhile, we have a survey that was done by the Forum on kind of popular opinion on how to reform Social Security, if we can get that slide up. Increasing the working age population, either through people having more babies, immigration, people working longer till they're older, would change some of this math. Is that on the horizon, Gary?
I mean, all these things are potentially on the horizon. I mean, they're all variables, right? The average work day, the average work week, family size, all of these things are definitely on the horizon. I'm trying to figure out what your chart says here. It says, views on preserving Social Security, raising taxes seems to win at the end of the day, seems to always be the path of least resistance. The issue we have here in this country on the tax issues, in everyone in this room is going to know what I'm going to say, we have an extraordinarily progressive tax system. We have a system where the top 10% of earners pay 75% of federal taxes. The bottom 50% of earners in the United States pay less than 10% of federal taxes. So if we want to just keep raising taxes, the question is, what is the effect on the population here? You keep going after the same 10% of workers. And the question is, are you willing to make fundamental changes to the tax system that I think would be very harmful to our country? Our country has known, and we were having this discussion at dinner last night, we're known because we are a risk-taking country. We're known because we have at-risk capital. It's not a mistake that most of the startup companies in the world got started here in the United States. In fact, over half of them were started by foreigners because they came in the United States because we had risk-based capital. One of the reasons we have risk-based capital is because we have a tax system that incentivizes taking risk. We tax risk-based capital at a different rate than we tax ordinary income. A lot of that wealth and a lot of that income is in returns on risk-based capital. I'm not an advocate. I wouldn't be an advocate for changing the system of how we have grown our economy. But if you're going to get more money out of that top 10%, you're going to have to look at things that I think are relatively draconian, are going to change the way we as a nation have grown. And we have grown by putting risk-based capital to work, which then ultimately creates jobs and creates huge opportunities in this country.
One thing we did in California we set up a commission to deal with the tax code, and similar to what Gary is saying on a national level, is dominant in California. Less than 1% of the taxpayers account for about 50 to 55% of the revenues for California. And it used to be that the budget was reliant on the sales and use tax, and that shifted. It used to be 60% sales and use tax, 25% or so personal income tax. The opposite now. So a bipartisan group, 7 appointed by the legislature, 7 appointed by the governor, came forward and said, let's recommend changing the system. Take the personal income tax brackets from 6 to 2. Take the top rate from about 9 to 10 down to 6%. Reduce it. Eliminate the corporate tax. Eliminate the state component of the sales and use tax. And among other things, establish a business net receipts tax, somewhat a form of value-added tax helped develop by a brilliant mind, my good friend Michael Boskin. Recommended across the board by the 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. Not every Democrat agreed to it, but over a majority. What did the legislature do? Nothing. I recommend that any commissions that were established to deal with economic policy require, in establishing those commissions, that a vote be taken by the legislature on each of the recommendations made. Don't let it be a staff-supported activity. But California is illustrative. Some people in California have said they want to make the entire country look like California. God help us.
We wouldn't have any houses. So one pathway out of this that would be less painful potentially is if AI, other advances generate productivity gains that change the economic landscape. Gary, you're at IBM. You're a resident technologist on this panel. How plausible is that?
Look, AI is going to have a dramatic impact on the way we work, the way we run our businesses, the way we run our country. We're going to have, we are on the verge of having quote unquote digital workers today. So we are going to have machines that do a lot of the work that is being done by humans today. Now, the vast majority of that work, before anyone gets all excited, is work that has, high error rates, high turnover, high dissatisfaction. It's work that people don't like doing right now. So the digital workers will replace a lot of those people, and they will do the work very efficiently, very high job satisfaction, and low turnover rate. What we have seen historically, and if you look back at the history of this country, when we've gone through one of these major technological evolutions, revolutions, shift, and you go all the way back to the combustion engine, the cotton gin, the internet, the cell phone, what happens is we end up having to retool some people. People earlier in their career, obviously easier to retool. People later in their career, you have to spend some time in figuring out how to reintegrate them into the workforce. But what the history will tell us is as companies get more efficient, they just grow, and they grow bigger. They grow substantially bigger. So the history of us bringing in disruptive technology into American businesses is that the companies get bigger, they get more efficient, they get more profitable, and in the end, they hire substantially more people.
So, there is the situation where AI, at least right now, what it's best at is moving around words, numbers, coding, things like that, not, treating caring for an elderly person with dementia or clearing a bedpan. Is there a mismatch between the kinds of things that AI will solve for, make more efficient, make more productive, and the needs of a kind of aging society?
Look, the AI evolution to robots, which is what you're sort of talking about, are we going to get into robotic? Are we going from digital workers, which are basically machines that can do work, to robotic workers that can do some of those, let's say, menial tasks or tasks that people don't want to do, low job satisfaction jobs? Like, there will be a natural evolution that we will have robotic workers in some of these areas, which will create efficiencies. I don't believe, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't believe that you're going to go see a digital doctor anytime soon in your life. And in fact, if we're headed that way, this is one of the weird things that come out of my mouth. That needs to be a regulated industry because the medical community is a regulated industry. I'm not a big regulator.
Are you allowed to say that in the Reagan Library?
But if the task is regulated today and it's being done by a machine, it should be a regulated task even in a digital world. So my view is, if we're going to go all the way down the edge of AI replacing, higher value added tasks, we're going to have to treat those tasks as they were done by human beings. And by the way, this AI revolution is leading to something that's even more interesting, which is all quantum computing, which we're less than 5 years away. When we get to quantum computing with AI, it's a whole nother leg up in technology.
I saw, I don't know, Gary, you'd be closer than I am, but I saw a statistic that said by 2030, up to 30% of the hours worked could be automated, could be. And if that is close, the tax system is something that will be looked at, but there are different ways to approach it. I, for one, wouldn't say that you could tax automation more. I don't think that's a good thing. Automation will improve productivity, profitability, growth. But there are other things. We could shift the payroll tax to some extent. You could fund your social programs out of automation. There are ways to look at it, but the tax system will be part of the discussion as automation takes over that kind of percentage.
Sorry.
I would just like to, just sitting here hearing this conversation, it just resonated with us being in the Reagan Library, a big quote of President Reagan when he viewed how the government viewed the economy. He said, if it's moving, tax it. If it continues to move, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And whenever you think about that, that's what we could do with innovation and AI, is if government gets too involved, they're going to destroy it.
I agree.
And we need to have a fair balance in anything. And that was what Reagan said decades ago. And I think it just really hits point right here.
Yeah, look, on this whole issue of the tax code, the tax code will evolve. But if we get more and more into a digital economy, it's not like all of our workers are disappearing. People are going to be buying a lot more hardware. They're going to be buying a lot more storage. They're going to be buying a lot more technology people. There are people that are going to be employed by this world.
Sure.
You can go back and how every one of you ran your businesses in 1990 when you had someone on your floor that printed memos, then put them in your mailbox to tell you to go to a meeting an hour from now. It sounds funny when you hear that, but we had that in my work life. Every floor of every office building had mail delivery service. Email comes and you no longer need someone to tell you where to go, but that person that was delivering that mail, they became a higher value added person. I think in this digital revolution, we are going to create just as many jobs and more jobs, and I think they're going to be higher paying jobs because the technical skill level you're going to need, whether it's your robots or whether it's your AI or whether it's quantum computing, the skill level is going to be higher, the pay level is going to be higher, and there's going to be plenty of income and corporate profits to tax.
And there would be, I think, a big push for job retraining. And we can be committed to job retraining as part of a program.
So back on the kind of long-term demographics, entitlements outlook, the other thing that might shift that balance would be higher fertility rates, more babies. Not immediately, it takes 20 years for a baby to become a part of the workforce, but is there anything policy can and should be doing? The Trump administration has talked a little bit about this, Chairman Smith. What can Congress or should Congress be doing on encouraging child?
This is definitely a part of the conversation, but I would just revert back to a lot of those issues. We have various provisions within the One Big Beautiful Bill that can help make it easier for for people to work and have a family. We increased the child tax credit in this bill, another $500 to $2,500. We also addressed paid family leave, which was a very important thing from originally in 2017 that we put within this legislation. So there's numerous things you can do. Of course, the baby bonds initiative is something that's put in here to help the trajectory of future kids. But there's a few things. I also believe that when you look at the no tax on overtime that was in it, that really helps a declining workforce.
Yeah.
Because it incentivizes more productivity of the current workforce so that they can work and not have to pay taxes on that overtime whenever you're already having difficulty in having enough employees.
Let's go to a question from the audience. State and local tax policy often undermines or duplicates federal efforts, particularly in areas like housing, labor mobility, climate investment. What role should federal policy play in coordinating with or correcting subnational fiscal behavior? Maybe, Jerry, you've been on these California boards. What can be done to coordinate the federal and state level policy environment better?
Well, I just think that there's got to be a closer coordination between what's happening at the state level, the budgeting process to go through. If there is a common problem relating to the personal income tax, which there is, that should be addressed by both the state and the federal government. Right now, it's almost as if the state is operating in a different country, and there's no reason for that.
Great. Another question back on the bond market. Looking forward, four of the largest purchasers of U.S. Treasuries will be diminishing their investment. The Federal Reserve through QE, or now QT, quantitative tightening, China, Japan, and regulated U.S. banks. At the same time, the supply of Treasuries will expand dramatically due to current and future deficits. What's the balancing point in these trends, Gary?
Well, historically, the balancing point has been rate. You know, that market's clear at a clear.
Supply, demand.
Yes, basic supply demand. You know, but look, we are beholden to foreign direct investment into the bond market. I don't think we are never going to be, well, never is a long time. I don't think we're going to be a country that can support our own debt market. We are going to need foreigners to come in and buy a percentage of our debt market. We're going to want them to come in and buy. Historically, over the last 20 or 30 years, buying dollars, buying U.S. assets, buying U.S. debt has been the best investment foreigners have been able to make for a long period of time. I don't think that's a bad place to be. We would want foreigners coming in and lending money to the U.S. government so we can continue to deliver. And I just think that's a reality that we're going to need foreign direct investment, both in our corporate world, but in our government spending as well.
I think we have to be careful in that equation. I totally agree with what Gary just said, but I think we need to be careful on how trade policy fits in to this equation. And what are we doing in terms of undermining or potentially undermining, attracting foreigners, if you will, to do exactly what you were recommending?
Chairman Smith, do you think of there being a tipping point on interest rates where the debt service cost gets so high that it requires kind of radical reform? Is that something on your radar?
I think people should be very concerned. Before I was chairman of Ways and Means 2.5 years ago, I was the Republican leader of the House Budget Committee. So looking at debt deficits was my main focus. And I remember the interest expense that we paid just 3 years ago was right around $300 billion a year to service our debt. Now it's over $1.1 trillion to service our debt. So if members of Congress aren't focused on that expense whenever it's more than the defense budget, then they probably shouldn't be in Congress.
I mean, is this a way in which we're lulled by the 2010s when interest rates were near zero for much of a decade and much higher debt burdens seemed plausible and manageable than they look like right now? Yeah. Is that right? All right, final questions on Social Security, entitlements, demographics. what now? Does anything happen between now and 2032, 2033 when there's the risk of imminent cuts to Social Security benefits? Is there a pathway to having some of the stuff worked out before the last minute, or are we kicking the can until there's no other choice?
Well, we have to be on the verge of a crisis. It's, you know, we used to say in Washington, a crisis brings about change. And you got to be right on the verge in order for, unfortunately, in order for bipartisanship to play.
You would hope, and this is hope, that we could start attacking some of the unbelievably low-hanging fruit. Like, I'll give you an example.
Right.
A child born in 2026, I don't think they're going to vote next year. A child born in 2026, their retirement age could be 72. And the actuarial tables might tell you that. I understand it's really hard to change a retirement date on someone that might vote in the next couple of years, but they're not going to vote for another 18 years. I think we could take some shots. But no, you're laughing. We have to start at the basics.
And that's the kind of thing.
So look, if that's not a bipartisan move, because we know that since the last time we changed Social Security eligibility, life expectancy is up 4.5 years. Right. So why don't we raise the retirement eligible age up till 70, 72 right now for people born next year and beyond, and then maybe put in some escalator. Maybe it goes up a month a year for the next 20 years.
Just the age and the cost of living calculation. Yeah. Those two things could address a major part of the Social Security issue.
Yep. Coming to a 2028 presidential debate near you, how this stuff can get worked out in the next presidential term. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Gary Cohn, Jerry Parsky, Jason. Thank you. And Reagan.